Všechno je jinak.
Žába, no, to je hodně zajímavá zkušenost. V podstatě asi ta nejzásadnější v mém životě.
Tam se neobjevilo nic z mýho života, tam se neobjevilo nic z archetypálních oblastí. Tam všecko se soustředili do toho jednoho zdroje světla, kde jsem měl pocit, že to je celá existence v takové abstraktní formě.
Myslím si, že Bufo Alvarius je doopravdy nejvyšší práce z psychedeliky, jakou si lze představit.
The first moment of the medicine was vibration, was light, was this sacred geometry coming in every single direction. And it was beauty, it was love, and it was peace.
I'm really happy to give this talk after this very insightful documentary that everyone's just seen, because it covers a lot of the fundamentals, a lot of the initial questions. An initial question that I've got is who here would be happy to out themselves as having had a 5-MeO DMT experience? Okay, so we got, this is, you're not going to be on camera, by the way. All features will be blurred, apparently. Anyway, in my view, it's good to be as open about these things as one possibly can be, so as not to live a split life. And I've sort of pursued that from the beginning with a kind of, I think any person who enters into these realms has to sort of work out a mode of coexistence with a society that's hostile, or not a society so much that's hostile, but a kind of official culture which is committed to ignorance and committed to reproducing ignorance. And on the other hand, I guess some of the wilder claims of those who've been recently bathed in the infinite and perhaps feel that anything is possible, or that nothing matters, or whatever else. And so there are various kinds of interpretations that come out of an experience like this, and I've put some of these up on the board, and I've put them up on the board to remind me to get to them. So if I run out of time, then we can deal with that maybe in discussion and questions afterwards. But essentially, at the center here, if you like, this unmarked center of the experience, this X, there's a sort of a scatter response of what I call kind of polarized metaphysical attitudes. And here I am already beginning to talk about it. So maybe I will pull myself away and let's indicate that I'll get there. Because what I want to, a couple of things I want to say as sort of introductory is, I'm just going to talk really kind of at the edge of my understanding, with the understanding that the documentary has already dealt with basic stuff, because that's what keeps me interested, and I think, unfortunately, a lot of the discourse around these experiences is kind of caught at the level of introductory work over and over and over again, because you can't assume that people have any idea what you're talking about, and also you're dealing with multiple levels of misrecognition that we're kind of primed to anticipate. The misrecognition that would come, say, from people with a scientific naturalist cast of mind, or the misrecognition that might come from people who are embedded very deeply in a particular religious worldview, which is sort of textually, doctrinally authorized. Or the misrecognition that might come out of, say, I guess, let's just call it, say, the 1960s, and certain kind of stereotypes that emerge around that. Whereas if I want to try to get across to you why this experience seems something that I want to some extent, organize my life around. And I don't think it's too much to say that. And I don't mean only this experience, but I mean this experience as sort of a culmination of a psychedelic, entheogenic kind of path, which has been my own psychotherapeutic, psychospiritual path. It's because I see in it some of the utopian potential that is indicated in that documentary towards the end. You know, the idea that if it can be so quickly revelatory for an individual, then it can have an ongoing resonant healing effect, a resonant enlightening effect for a humanity that's in pretty perilous situation, where there's an accumulation of what previously might have been thought forms which were relatively adaptive and now have become a kind of inertial stupidity, a kind of cosmic avidya, you know, this cosmic ignorance that is embedded deep in our institutions. I don't mean that they're only ignorant. You know, there's an incredible matrix of sort of knowledge, technoscience, and in some sense the capitalist economy is a kind of miraculous product, but at the same time it's generative of such short-sightedness and injustice and destruction. So I see some of the utopian potential of substances like this as educators, as catalysts for the emergence of the kind of consciousness that seems to be needed if we're going to have a better chance to get through this historical bottleneck. And that's where the juice is for me. That's why I see them as potential agents, or actually not actual agents of change. On the other hand, I can't but help place the very enthusiastic ideas that emerge when one has very recently visited these kind of peak states with some of the actualities on the ground, not just the actualities of the world situation, but of this small community of people. Like, for example, you saw on the documentary Octavio, several people have died in Octavio's sessions, probably unnecessarily. And you know, he admits this has happened. I don't know how many, but it seems to me that as a proto-community, as the community becomes more self-conscious, it hopefully develops ways of getting around that kind of a problem where people needlessly die, to put it as straightforwardly as that. Nobody goes into an experience like this, presumably, wanting to die, although you may well have to go through a point where it's okay if you die. In a sense, that's the portal. In a sense, that is the portal. But there's also worse than that. There's another very well-known facilitator, Dr. Jerry Sandoval, and there have been an accumulation of accusations to the point, you know, including sexual abuse and drugging and so on, to the point where he was uninvited from the World Bufo Various Congress that happened in Mexico in July. He was the only person uninvited. And yet he still continues going around the world, and no doubt it may well be that 95% of people have a glorious, maybe even life-changing experience, but unfortunately it seems, we'd have to say that I think that the evidence from a person like that is that this is not just, say, a perversion of a sacrament, but it's a kind of another side. It's another possibility, a sort of a shadow side of this substance, or maybe in combination with other substances, because I don't think that that 5-MeO is the only thing that Jerry, or maybe, and I don't want to only sort of focus on Octavio or Jerry, and neither do I want to conflate the two. But I think it's unavoidable to see that this is happening, and there's been I guess a sort of ethic of friendship and concerns about legality, and in the absence of charges being brought and so on. and lack of clarity about what's actually going on, and reluctance to be accusing anybody of anything you're not sure of, and so on. There's been a reluctance to talk about these things, but I have said that just now, precisely because this is one instance where there's a kind of existential choice as this substance goes out into the world. Is it going to be something that helps genuinely to wake us up? Not on its own, but as a vital stimulant to getting a better sense, a more adequate sense of who we are as human beings, what we've always been on about, what we've been unconsciously driving towards. Is it going to be that kind of catalyst? Or is it going to be another round of narcissistic self-idealization and misrecognition? And so far, I would have to say that the answer is yes. It's going to be both. It's going to be both. And there are choices to be made here. And part of our common responsibility is to try to help each other to avoid some of the problems that have emerged, so that it can be a kind of force as much as possible for letting go of our accumulated, historically sedimented, I was going to say bullshit, but just, let's say, inadequate. Yeah, I can say bullshit. It's not that I'm really scared of swearing. It's more that it's looking for the adequate words, you know. So the inadequacies of our sedimented, institutionalized ways of thinking, our reality principles, which sort of go on whether we like it or not. So maybe this is the point at which I can maybe mention some of these kind of standard, what I've seen as some of the kind of responses. So in the middle, maybe the best way to, or the quickest way to speak about what it is it's an existential truth event. For the person concerned, and whatever I say here that might sound like it's affirming the experience, let's just treat it as this is the phenomenology. It's a phenomenology of absolute unmasking, where, as it were, you understand implicitly, without any possibility of doubt, as long as the dose is good enough, without any possibility of doubt, that your entire biographical personality, your consciousness hitherto, your unconsciousness, the way that your personality is embedded in how your body works, in its energetics, in the way that a culture is embedded in your body, that all of that has had a coefficient of neurosis, that all of that has been in some way paranoid, that it's keeping something at bay. And this makes sense if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective. The kind of consciousness that we're familiar with on this planet is its organismic consciousness. It has a particular body, and it's in an ecology where it might get eaten, right? And any given culture, if you want to sort of have an archetypal image of a culture, you've got a fire, you've got a realm at nighttime that the fire lights up, and then you've got the big bad forest beyond. And that's the sort of the limit, or rather some imaginings about the black beyond are the limit of the culturally instantiated form of consciousness that each individual is then inhabited by. What this immersion into this experience seems to teach, I think, is that what is ultimately feared is not actually precisely death at the hands of, or at the mouth, the jaws of some predator, something like that. And it's not precisely, the army that's in the neighboring valley and that's ready to come over the ridge. It's actually that you would be forced to give up the specificity of this particular embodied consciousness, and that you would just be dissolved into whatever that is, whatever this is. And so death here is like a sort of a frontier soldier that sits there, and that you're afraid of death, and death seems to have this specific, there's ways of dying that you're afraid of. But behind that is that that your specific identity will be lost. Well, you take this and your specific identity is lost. And then the kind of strange miracle happens. Well, first of all, it can be pretty rough sometimes. There'll be a sort of passage through complete disorientation, a kind of madness. As many of the wisdom traditions and shamanic kind of the archetypal journeying, mapping suggests, you might have to go through a kind of moment of madness / moment of death, or anticipatory death. But yet what seems to happen is that then the good news happens. And it's kind of unimaginably good. It's like, as you saw in the documentary, it's almost like some sort of piece of heaven were just granted you. And it's the price you pay for it is that you cannot doubt it. Because you're in a kind of an energetics, a sort of Gnostic metabolism where doubt is a defense mechanism that has to be shed, where skepticism and critical thinking is, etc., has to be shed, and where you want to shed it because you come to see that you've always been somewhat neurotic, and that now finally is your chance to let that go. And that's why you arrive. That's why you have a sense of, finally, I get to be inhabited by what I have always been desiring unconsciously, which might be to be home in the world, in the universe, to know myself as this. And I find that experience, and I think many of us who've gone through it, we find it so profound that we feel loyal to that experience. And it feels like it kind of illuminates where we ought to be going, that humans have been in various ways through various social organizations and battles and ideologies and so on, have been attempting to move deeper and deeper into this kind of knowing. Their God images have been about this, their science, their technology, etc. It's in one way or their resource struggles, their egoism, their narcissism, their immortality projects, the desire to be both sexes, the desire to be one sex. All of this has been in different facets of the same obscure object of desire that now is suddenly kind of presented to you as, okay, you've been after this, now you can have it. Now you get to have it. So you can well imagine you go through an experience like that and you feel some fidelity to that experience. Now, some people feel that it's a betrayal of the knowing that comes with that experience to do anything but sort of speak from there. Which is to say, they talk spiritual, if you want. They got religion on this thing. My personality is such that I want to be a bridge builder, and also I want to reserve the right to be skeptical subsequently of what it was that I was shown. Some people are very well prepared to declare that anything that is not revealed there is illusory. So truth is all on the side of what is shown in the 5-MeO revelation, and everything else is some form of misunderstanding, some form of fear-based egoity, and so on. I'm not so sure. I'm aware that I'm always speaking from where I happen to be in this sort of passage of learning, and I'm pretty sure that as I go on, I'll revise what I'm saying. But I think that I'm more committed to the idea that maybe I should say this. There's something extremely paradoxical about the 5-MeO DMT revelation. On the one hand, it seems to be cognate as was suggested in the documentary, with these kind of extremely rarefied states of knowing being that get names like Dhammakaya or Shunyata, Samadhi, etc. It seems like the Buddhists and the Hindus and so on seem to have really been the ones that have specialized in this kind of total unification, self-clarification vocabulary. Whereas in the Middle East / West, we've had a much more relational understanding of the divine, where it's basically verboten. It's taboo to have complete unification with God or the Godhead, and only certain esoteric schools or mystical schools are kind of slip in the side and kind of speak in a somewhat disguised language about ultimate identity. But that kind of language expresses an intuition or a certainty that ultimately it's all unified. It's all the one substantiality, all the one intelligence. And this is, maybe I should clarify, this is an understanding which is not just mental. It's a total energetics. And then as your personality is sort of rendered up on the pyre and burnt off, the understanding as an energetic release is continuous with love. So love here is not a kind of emotion confined to the interiority of your body. It's a mode of attunement. It's a way in which the world or existence shows itself. And it's a kind of knowing beyond fear that has that sense of self-certainty. The same kind of, it's like an expanded version of the self-certainty you've got right now that you exist. You exist beyond qualities. You don't have, like, your existence is this unqualified self-presencing. This is just expanded into, without limit, and expanded as love, because love is this sort of attunement where nothing is held outside. Nothing is ultimately feared. Nothing is seen to be totally foreign. So, if that's communicating something of it, from that standpoint, or rather from that experience, one of the interpretations which is quite prevalent is what I've kind of nastily dubbed the Panglossian. And Professor Pangloss is a character in Voltaire's Candide. And Voltaire's Candide is a satirical novel making fun of the philosophy of Leibniz, who you could sort of sum up the philosophy as everything is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. So poor Candide grows up in sort of utopian situation, and then life under the pen of Voltaire just hammers him over and over and over again, but he's always kind of going, well, it's all for the best, you know. And I think this position makes a lot of sense when I'm about to criticize it, but I want to give it some of its due, which is that the portal to the kind of state that I was just describing, of a pure knowing being that is without limit, and a pure potency, an omnipotentiality without limit, that the portal to that is to drop any complaint against reality, any judgment. Because all judgment is based on previous experience and is oriented to some way that the world should be in the future. Which is to say, you're stretched out rather than being purely present here, now. To be purely present here, now, you have to drop all that, and you have to have complete, utter acceptance, surrender, if you want. That's what allows being as a hunter to come and take you. In that context, it's very kind of plausible or seductive to assume that all you need to do to sort of stay enlightened, as it were, or to be loyal to that experience is just to accept everything, to not have any judgment. And what you then end up thinking is that all of this ought, all of these oughts that humans have, all of this better rather than worse and so on, that all of this is a kind of artificial human construction. It's the very form of our misunderstanding of reality. And consequently, once you're not judging, you kind of trust. And the idea is that you're just going to trust all the way that everything is always for the best. I find this, to go to the other side now, I find it essentially intellectually and ethically abhorrent position, finally. Because it tells, I don't think you can go to the end with it, because it ends up saying, okay, napalm is dropped on villages in Vietnam and that's all for the best. You know, so you're in this kind of completely inhuman position. And what's more, what you do is you assume that enlightenment means a pure contemplative standpoint, where you're just observing, because it's all for the best already. Rather than seeing that the point, in a sense, is to go through the experience and then bring that understanding back into the world process as a kind of clarification of what we ought to be doing. A way of showing us how lost we have been in an attempt to show, no, well, those norms may have been adequate to a previous era or may not, but now we better overthrow those norms and we better overthrow the material interests that are embodied in those norms or make use of them and institute new ones. For example, do we give any credence to the rights or value of other living beings? You know, a pretty vital question. And most of our norms at this stage are, you know, outside Hinduism and Buddhism, are not very well equilibrated for taking care of that which is currently being destroyed, which is not human. Just as one example. So my view is that ultimately it's ethically untenable, that standpoint, even though I can see why it makes sense to people to have that standpoint. The other thing is I don't think they can actually live it. When it comes to their own lives, they're going to be pretty clear that it's better not to walk in front of the bus, it's better to be fed, it's better to have the next breath. Well, if it's better for them, what about other people? The opposite standpoint, in a sense, is what I call the Messianic. And that's where people kind of catch fire. It's a sort of Promethean archetype. It's the archetype of saving the world. Like, this stuff really could help us. You know, there was one guy in the documentary who was saying, if only we could get everyone, the politicians, and we could actually save ourselves. And people have said this about LSD and mescaline and on. And there's always the problem of, well, how, quite apart from anything else, how would you get to the point where everyone would want to take this stuff? And then, as we see, it doesn't necessarily produce the picnic that we suggested it was going to produce. But on the other hand, I'm extremely sympathetic to the Messianic standpoint, because like I said, I'm interested in this as a catalyst for social, civilizational, spiritual change. Another axis of difference, which became very obvious in Mexico when I was at the Congress in July, and subsequently, is what I call the Protestant Western Buddhist versus the Catholic Shamanic axis. And I guess I would say that facilitators on the Protestant Western Buddhist side, they construe what they're trying to, their function is to facilitate the person having the experience to have their unmediated relationship with samadhi, Godhead, you name it, the source, whatever, however you want to construe it. And so your job is just to facilitate that unmediated relationship. In a sense, it's a non-relational model, unmediated, even if you've got to be there to help it to happen. On the Catholic shamanic side, it's quite different. the facilitators are more often conceived of as shamans, and they will be maybe intervening quite heavily in the process, being very present energetically with songs, with rattles, invoking ancestors, protective spirits, and so on. And what is super interesting is that people will often have experiences which include voices of the ancestors, which include animal spirits, and so on. So, and this is also partially dependent upon dosage, I think, but it's also dependent upon the kind of the cultural cosmology that has fed the psyches that are going through this experience. And in Mexico, which is a highly religious and maybe only nominally monotheistic culture, then you get a proliferation of Catholic saints, and you've got a very strong presence of the pre-Christian indigenous cosmologies. Then this is the approach. And this approach, I think, is very interesting because, that is the Catholic shamanic, because it seems to set up, it seems to be more inviting for a communal experience. So there are quite a number of, well, I don't know how many, but I've come across a few cases of whole families going through the toad experience in Mexico, including children and grandparents, and I find that quite a moving thing, frankly. And there's a real kind of boldness, maybe / recklessness, but there's a boldness about the approach. It's partly because these days, sort of smoking the toad there's a dimension of it in Mexican culture which is a bit like getting pissed in Australia, or going and having some mushies when you're an adolescent in Australia. Like you can go and have some peyote, get smashed on peyote, and go and get smashed on toad. Yeah, man. Believe it or not, there's that aspect. It's very informal. I'm not saying it's all over the place, but there is that aspect. And so it kind of mediates. And one of the things I've noticed is that, and this will be a kind of setup for just saying something about the other categories. One of the things I've noticed is that all of the psychedelics, you tend to get a kind of attitudinal split between the safety first people and the psychonautic, if you want, kind of cowboy, go boldly where no one has gone before, alone with the alone, sort of exploratory attitude. And from that exploratory attitude, the safety-first consciousness standpoint can seem like a kind of residue of an inability to finally take your life in your own hands. And that the point of these substances ultimately is to be sovereign and to have no excuses. And see, that position tends to move back into the Panglossian in the sense that, well, you died, but that's what your soul was up for, and, or, well, you got PTSD from this encounter with this not too careful facilitator, but that's because you didn't have due diligence and prudence, and so there's there can be a radical individualization of responsibility. On the other hand, you have the sort of people maybe who've got more traumatized psyches as children or whatever. Those of us who are quite concerned, we don't want to go and get PTSD. We've had enough of that, thank you very much. And we'd be very happy to be well looked after. And I just think it's a place for everyone, and it's more that you want to be able to have a culture which makes people aware that these are the options, rather than thinking that one is right. And as I say, there's an undercurrent of, say, Catholic versus Protestant, or Mexican versus US, Mexico's North America, but Mexican versus US or Western Europe. There are all of these cultural undercurrents as well. Different forms of masculinity, it gets complicated. Femininity, for that matter. Now, I just want to talk about two perversions, what I call perversions of the Messianic. And I've seen these. To talk about the Scribbler first, the Scribbler is a facilitator who wants to scribble their signature in the corner of the absolute. So they are very keen that you don't forget that they were the one who gave you the golden key. And you will be forever in debt to them. And I see this, to the degree that it's conscious, it's just an all too human narcissism. It's an expression of our drive for immortality. It's not enough to just show somebody this. It's, I want to be the culture hero that showed the way. And I think it's in some sense entirely understandable, forgivable, etc. And on the other hand, it's kind of the primordial mistake made by the world religions, insofar as what they do is they produce this inextricable mixture of genuine revelatory insight, opening to the transcendent, techniques of ecstasy, etc., and something which is ineluctably just of its time, of that particular personality, of that particular culture, that particular, language game, etc. And then it gets illegitimately eternalized, and we get stuck with texts that can't be revised, and laws that came down from the mountaintop and that are supposedly it's heretical to criticize them, and all of those things that in the end become obstacles to a relationship, to a more intimate relationship to our own being. So that scribbler position, I think, is one that we ought to try to be aware of. And for example, somebody might make sure that their face is the first thing that you see as you come out of the experience. Well, why is that? Why does that have to be the case? More sinister is the black diamond. And I've taken this from the testimony of somebody who claims to have been abused by a facilitator, and she knew him quite well, enough to kind of come up with a sort of diagnosis. And it's a diagnosis that resonates with a book. I've forgotten the author right now, but maybe somebody would know it. It's called Darkness Shining Wild. Robert Augustus Masters, thanks. That's one of the very first books ever written on I think, synthetic 5-MeO DMT. Really worthwhile, and it shows an intrinsic, if you want, dark side of the medicine. And what could that mean? What it could mean is that in this stripping away of the way that the personality is in command of by rights of your particular human being, in that stripping away, what you might meet, rather than the good news of love and universal sort of intelligence and so on, what you might meet, maybe if you've burnt through some empathy circuits, I don't know, maybe there's some I don't know what's going on at a neurological level, but what you might meet is not only a kind of indifferent universe, like such as we get with scientific naturalist conceptions of a purely material, non-intelligent universe, but kind of much more disturbing, which would be the idea that somehow baked into reality is a kind of malevolence. You get this with some evolutionary theorists now, the anti-natalists, for example, who just argue that the sum of suffering is much worse than the sum of pleasure, and that it would be better not to being born. Just as a little parenthesis, my last name is Job, and the poor Job went through a situation where he said it would be better not to have been born. And what he's grappling with there is this spectre, but that maybe, and this is well developed within Gnosticism, the spectre that maybe the creator of this thing is a demon. Now, Gnosticism has a get-out-of-jail card because before this malevolent creator, there's a good principle, if you want, the non-creative but still omnipotential thing. But if you imagine you just excise that, and in some ways it's the most terrifying thought, I think, that a human being might possibly have, that your deepest opening to what is shows you that it's kind of bad all the way down. For some of you, that won't make sense. How can existence be either good or bad? But what I really appreciate about all my experiences with psychedelics is that the dice seems to be loaded the other way. You know, no matter how shitty some aspects of our lives can be, no matter how heartbroken we can be, there is a kind of salvific presencing of the universe in and through these experiences, which testifies to a kind of fundamental biophilia, you know, a kind of a caringness or a goodness. And that might seem like anthropomorphic projection, but it feels like a pretty good wager to me. So the black diamond position, the way I think about it is, okay, you might have exposure to that possibility that maybe it's not good, it's sort of fundamentally not good. And then another aspect of 5-MeO is that it does not necessarily address the entire psyche. People, as you saw from the film, it's very much concentrated on the ultimate. It's not that involved in the mundane and the nitty-gritty. That's a work, that's a post-experience labor that you need to sort of patiently work on. And so if it hasn't touched primal narcissistic wounds, envy, everything that Freud declared to be described as the id, these sort of basic instincts of orality and of me, and so on. If that's been deeply wounded, then what can happen is, far from this being a medicine that helped you, it just provides a massively enlarged canvas in which this unmetabolized sort of negative narcissism can then be played out. So you can stomp around the world as a sort of bringer of light and love, and yet be really doing people over here and there when opportunity arises, whatever. So the only way I can think of that is that maybe it's grounded in a kind of sense that that something is deeply wrong. I tend to think that there's probably only part-time black diamonds. Maybe, I don't know that you could live with that as a full-time way of experiencing and thinking. So I guess I just want to say one more thing to finish up. I suggested that this is a kind of a truth event, an existential truth event, and that it has the opportunity, insofar as it becomes a subcultural, that the truth event sort of ripples through the healing community, ripples through academic communities and the understanding of human being, etc. It becomes a sort of truth event that becomes an agent within the development of human history. It may not. It may remain marginal. All of the methods that are mobilized to keep it marginal may succeed. But the reason I think in some ways that it's got such a radical promise is because the dominant interpretive culture that we live in, at least in the sort of Western globalized zone, is one of incredulity towards transcendent truth claims. All transcendent truth claims are likely to be interpreted as just a kind of revanche of traditionalist doctrinal dogma. You know, oh, you blindly believe in this. You've dropped your skepticism. You're no longer scientific, etc. And within the realm of science, let's say, when you dig into it, you get it to, rather than finding certainty, you find, at least at the level of kind of philosophy of science, you get uncertainty, you get quantum uncertainty. If you dig into mathematics, you get various proofs that that it's impossible to have proofs of all equations, you get logical paradoxes. Within art, you get all of these modes of human self-consciousness which are, if you want, at variance to the kind of security that trust and faith and belief in a God gave us. And so this will be interpreted as as a kind of cultish and ultimately illegitimate power grab, you know, an attempt to authorize ourselves in the name of transcendent truth. The point, though, is that it's democratic, fundamentally democratic. It doesn't require any, you don't have to sign up to any doctrine. What you do have to have is a real desire to open yourself in the time that you've got to deep experience and to live with the consequences, which might be ones that set you at odds with people that you love and so on. But to me, that it feels like that is a transformative, alchemical kind of agent. And in the current circumstances, we need all the help we can get. And it seems worthwhile trying to help this experience to exfoliate in a way that maximizes its potential to help us. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so we've got a mic. We can run around the room for questions. Who would like to start us off? Anyone? Someone? Brendan?
You mentioned synthetic 5-MeO DMT. Can you just maybe discuss a little bit, are there differences between the synthetic and the natural? Are there different schools of thought around this as to whether one is better than the other or whether you should pursue one rather than the other?
Yeah. So there's every possible opinion on the difference or non-difference between synthetic 5-MeO and the Bufo toxin, Bufo alvarius. I can say that for me, the experiences have been radically different. And the toad venom seemed to be magnitudes bigger. But it's very hard for me to know precisely whether this is because of dosage. It's kind of like the difference between moonlight and sunlight or something like that. So you go, at least on the synthetic, I've gone to what I call the diamond universe, you know, where it's absolute clarity. But I haven't gone to this furnace that burns my heart open, or that is like a sort of, as one of the people that I interviewed called it, an infinite orgasm of heart and soul. I haven't had that on the synthetic. But certainly people report pretty close to that. And it's quite clear that the toad is under pressure. So it would be a very good... And also the other thing I would say is the synthetic 5 is perhaps more gentle, if gentleness can be mentioned in the context of 5-MeO. And there are different modes of administration, you know. For example, you can have it rectally, and this is something that awaits me, but but people testify that it is a more gentle kind of, it can be a more gentle way. Although I guess there's some issues with dosage which you have to be very careful about. But you definitely, as a friend of mine said, you don't want to Bufo, because that's got a lot of other things in it which you definitely don't want, which will get burnt off when you vaporize it, but which would just be absorbed, essentially toxins would be absorbed. So don't make that mistake. Yeah, but anyway, if we're going to do our best to try to protect the toad, I think it would be very beneficial if some people with a lot of disposable income and sense of boldness were to encourage chemists to produce what we need.
Thank you for your talking. The toad venom contains bufetinine as well as 5-MeO, doesn't it? So that's where that sort of heart kind of burning physiological, so the body sensations would be coming from. How would you identify the difference between the purposes of using, so say there's a difference between analytical insights, so 5-MeO might be mostly a pure experience without any hardship in the body, but then yeah, I'm sort of curious about what the actual utility of each of those specific chemicals is. So if you're trying to purge people, or if you're actually trying to investigate, maybe scientifically, the nature of that particular experience with those, do you know?
So
makes sense?
You're asking again about the...
I'm saying about bufetinine, yeah.
The differences.
Yeah.
Well, there's not only bufetinine, there are other alkaloids, etc., in the bufotoxin. So I think it's an open question about what the effects might be. One of the reassuring things about synthetic 5-MeO is that we have that 5-MeO DMT is an endogenous neurotransmitter. So we can have some security in knowing that our architecture is built to handle this. It may not be built to handle various toxins.
Just because the bufetinine is deadly, like has an LD50. Do you know what I mean? Whereas the 5-MeO doesn't necessarily have that. So like, if you're using toad poison, toad venom, different toads produce different alkaloid profiles.
But also, again, we don't really know what quantities of bufetinine are getting in when we vaporize the bufotoxin. We don't know the pathways of assimilation, etc. So I think that there's a lot of unknowns there. So if you've got concerns at that level, then, which is quite legitimate, particularly if you've got any cardiovascular issues, etc., it's quite legitimate to err on the side of caution and experiment more with the synthetic. But the synthetic, I wouldn't agree that it's only just a matter of understanding or something. Like it's what they call a release dose is a full bodily energetic release on the synthetic. That's how it works. So there isn't ultimately a distinction to be made between this kind of energetic purgation and the understanding. They're just different sides of the same opening.
I might just add there that Octavio Rettig did do an analysis of toad venom and found some 20 different compounds, including various subtryptamines, cardioglycids, which I personally think is responsible for a lot of the contortion you see with very high doses of toad venom. And another variable is toad venom's a free base, and there's even for me, a noticeable distinction between synthetic 5-MeO salt and synthetic 5-MeO free base. So many variables at play there.
Yeah, I'm curious to know if the experience of the 5-MeO DMT is more of a monist or a dualist experience, because it says it becomes one. Does that mean it's one substance of consciousness, or is there still duality between matter and consciousness? And the reason I ask is because if this is the gateway to this transcendent being, then it's ironic that it's dependent on a molecule. You know what I mean? Like, are we trying to transcend matter, or is experience just another one thing, or is it still separate from? And it goes to free will again. Is it like once it hits your system, then you don't need free will? It just happens because it's it's a bit deterministic, or is there still a struggle between?
Yeah, fantastic question. I think the way I'm going to get out of this is in a very sagely kind of way to say that the experience invites you into a kind of higher level version of these paradoxes. So rather than speak from the mountaintop here about how it really is, I would more say that you are opened to a much less culturally mediated, much more directly experiential version of these questions, so that rather than them being kind of curious philosophical detritus from some previous era, they're kind of metaphysical realities which you're plunged into the midst of. You know, where is freedom in all this? What is the ontological status of love? Is there such a thing? Can there be such a thing as reality experiencing or revealing itself in its truth? What does it mean to apply words to these states? Are these states where truth happens, or does truth have a home in a kind of bridge building between those states and more ordinary states of consciousness? That's how I see it. It's more like, I've come to think that a good society should be measured, at least in part, by the extent to which it makes available to every single human being the potential to come to grips with the mystery of its own being in that time that it's alive. And I don't mean that by coming to grips with it you answer everything, but you get to plunge your hands into the depths of this mystery of being here. And as soon as you do, then these kind of conceptual polarities, options, etc. emerge. But you know, once you've got that, then you can start thinking about them with, as it were, some fuel in the tank. Whereas if you take the case of, say, your typical philosophy undergraduate who's had a fairly limited and highly institutionalized life experience, and then they're exposed to, I don't know, Descartes and Hume and Plato and Aristotle and Hegel and Kant and so on, let alone all of the various, you know, religious clubs on campus vying for possession of their soul, then on what basis are they going to make this decision? Okay, they had a gap year and they went to Thailand or something, you know? I mean, I don't mean to denigrate being in that position, only to say that a culture that makes available essentially initiatory experiences, which at some level, and this is one thing I really like about some aspects of a shamanic culture, at some level there's a sort of willingness to let the initiate go and to have their experience and to develop their specific relationship with their specific plant and their specific understandings of the spirit of that plant and so on. It's always going to be cosmologically encapsulated one way or another, but it's a looser system. And so, yeah, that would be part of the answer to your question.
So it's like when the guy said about the brain is like when the TV is like the reception. So maybe this thing clarifies how you receive the signal, and then it's up to you what you do with the signal. It's a bit like that. You're okay?
Yeah, I think pretty unambiguously for me, all of these substances, by these I mean all of these sort of psychoactives, which you've all heard about, in one way or another, they reveal that ordinary consciousness, or there are varieties of ordinary consciousness, but let's just invoke them like that ordinary consciousness is quite anesthetized. It's highly protected, and it's routinized. So for example, many people will say the first breath, as soon as they hold that 5-MeO in their lungs, and they know with a kind of certitude that can't be argued with that all of their life has somehow led up to this moment, that it's sort of been converging on this moment. Now, if you think about it, you realize, well, that's true of every moment. You know, all of our lives led up to this very moment, right? And yet, almost all moments just pass by with a sort of boring familiarity, whereas certain moments sort of jump out of the pack and are remarkable, and they become lodestones for our self-interpretation. And I think the reason, or a reason why you see the person's face disappear, it's holding the pipe for you, and you go, oh God, it's come to this, is because there's a sense of ultimacy. It's like something is ending here. There's an innocence that's ending now. There's a lostness that's ending now. I can't really explain precisely how that knowledge is communicated so quickly. But it's got obviously something to do with this stripping away of the anesthetic of ordinary consciousness. Yeah. So, I guess from a skeptical external perspective, you might say it's just a brain state, hallucinatory brain state. But to me, that's all too complacent about ordinary consciousness and the brain states that correlate to ordinary consciousness, and how, or let's say ordinary consciousness plus scientifically specialized consciousness, which makes reality appear under the guise of objectivity and causality and so on. It's all too complacent about that. It's complacent about what is the reality principle that you're standing on when you make judgments. Here you're kind of given an opportunity to have a different intuition of the ground that we stand on, or the groundless ground that we stand on, or are in.
I think just to extrapolate that on a little bit, with many of these documentaries and much of the discourse around 5-MeO is on the peak units of experience, and there's certainly very startling analogies with Vedanta states of samadhi and many of the Eastern non-dual philosophies. It's absolutely, unquestionably a non-dual state. There's no subject-object relationship left. Everything melds into a singularity. But what's often sort of understated in a lot of the discourse is the coming back into the self period, which can last sort of 40 minutes to an hour, where the self is reforming after complete dissolution. And that is where I think the set and setting and the ontological sort of paradigm that the ceremony is conducted in plays a massive role. Because it's like the dust is settling and reforming, and it can be reformed in a myriad of different ways, and so you do have to be very careful with how you hold the space for the person when that's happening. Yeah.
But quite apart from that practical aspect of coming back into a context which is sort of maximally like a cradle that a baby is in, which is, I think, recommended. I think what this brings up, I want to say something sacrilegious to the 5-MeO true believers. There's a way in which I think that quote-unquote non-dual state somehow, and this partly gets to what you're asking, Oliver, somehow is this paradoxical conjunction of naked self-presencing of being, true being if you want, and absolute deception. So what I mean by that is, on the one hand, the experience is of self-revelation of being through the human being that I am, unlimited self-revealing, where the essence, there's no distinction between essence and appearance, because any appearing is immediately folded back into essencing. There's nothing hidden, and there's no distinction between knower and known, between subject and substance. So therefore, it seems completely legitimate to say, well, this is an experience of non-duality. But let's just pan back for a moment, and there you've got a person that's writhing in a room that they don't experience, in a world that they don't experience, with a chemical going through their brain that they're no longer conscious of, probably, etc., etc., etc. So this non-dual experience is embedded in a greater duality, which you only become conscious of retrospectively or prospectively. You can't be conscious of it at the time. Although, this is one other caveat. I've talked to some people who have had a lot of 5-MeO, and they no longer, I don't know this is true for everybody, but some people who've had a lot of 5-MeO, they no longer have the out-of-body experience. They just sit there, almost sort of Zen Buddhist, like the sort of stereotype of the Zen Buddhist. They just sit there having their totally embodied, non-dual experience. It's quite uncanny. You can even talk and stuff like that. And nonetheless, I suspect there's all kinds of things that they actually can't perceive. If I can put it perhaps all too paradoxically, when there's complete illumination, you illuminate the shadowy side of life, but you do not perceive that which lives in the shadows as shadowed. So you don't perceive that which is finite as finite. You see it as folded into the infinite. You don't perceive that which is separate as separate. It's folded back into identity. But we know, unless we're just prepared to say all separation, all finitude, all limitation is illusory, we know that that's, if you want, that's how Source, to speak in these terms, Source manifests itself in all this sort of particularity, this individuality. So that's all, if you want, there's an experience of ultimate unicity, of ultimate oneness, and yet it has all of this stuff that it doesn't see. So what does that mean? It's got a shadow. So what does that mean? Ultimate unicity is dual. Which essentially, yeah, you're back into the paradoxes. Say again?
I mean, from a human context, looking that way.
Do you want to elaborate on that? Maybe you've got the answer.
No, I don't have the answers. I'm still trying to work them out. My first experience was about 3.5 years ago. And I decided to break my leg within seconds of my first intake of the medicine. So then I woke up, you know, in a state where I think there was a realisation that something had physically happened to me. And in the state I was in, there was nothing but love. So even though something, you know, terrible, you know, by some sense, happened to me, I was infused with love, so I poured that love through my leg as, you know, I could still walk. But we went in again, you know, probably within an hour, hour and a half or so of that. And luckily enough, you know, I sort of probably had a bit of a shift with that. And then I decided to take myself off to Mexico and really, really deeply dive into... No. It was profound, you know, where I went. And I went with my husband, and we were doing sessions together, which was amazing. And we did it in all settings. In the water was amazing. And we have travelled through a deepening of not only our relationship to self, our relationship with each other, the fact that we're in that space together, and we stayed conscious together throughout that was amazing. And where I'm trying to resolve, and it's an ongoing process and I'm loving it, is that I don't feel like I need it again, even though it'd be special and it'd be nice and I'd enjoy it. It's my human reality now is the trip. My infinite existence is home, and this is where I need to apply myself. This is where I need to breathe. This is where I need to remember to love, and the infinite love that came from that experience. When anything doesn't feel or appear like love, there's the challenge. So the duality's gone for me now. There's no good, there's no bad. There's just love. And if you can't find the love, look for the love or choose the love. So when I explain it to people, I say, it's a fairy in the corner of the garden and she's whispering, but she's there. You've got to find her, or you've just know that she's there and then bring that forward. Or to deliberately choose love in a circumstance where love doesn't feel like a natural emotion to have. So hence the challenge now is living day to day through that portal, you know, that you've come to, or you've evolved to a being that knows the other side. Whether that's home or this is home is only us looking back from Toad or looking forward to Toad. So again, we're constrained by our humanness. But in having said that, if someone said to you, hey, here's this substance, and it can, you know, the idea that someone presented the fact to me that, you know, we are part of an infinite consciousness, and the trip is we decide to go to Earth and have a human experience. Everyone says, yeah, pick me, pick me. That's what it feels like we actually are doing.
Thank you. And I mean, I definitely resonate to quite a lot of what you said. I think different personalities are maybe attuned to sort of different aspects of this kind of unveiling. In the peak state that you were mentioning, or that we've been talking about, there's a kind of harmonization of everything. So all words that in any way at least catch on the coattails of what it is are congruent with each other. They're just different facets of the same unicity, of the same sublime presencing. However, in the embodied world, they tend to come apart to some degree. So for example, I notice some people emphasize love much more, and some people emphasize truth much more. And in this realm, they're often somewhat in conflict. So people can get very distressed at any sign of discord and conflict amongst people who've had Toad. Aren't we all supposed to know that we're all one and that we're all love? Yes. On the other hand, if people are lying, if people are doing each other over, then love can become the means for putting into the shadow what doesn't want to be seen. So if the behavior is in discord, then truth emerges as the attempt to bring to consciousness the discord, which is actually happening in the embodied world. And so it seems to me some personalities are kind of more readily congruent with one aspect, or maybe with beauty. There are different, you know, there are different expressions of the same fundamental experience. And probably I'm more attuned to the truth side, I think. And it's a harder work, maybe, to be more fully grounded in the love. And actually, there's one other thing which I think maybe might be important, which is when we think about this kind of substance as something that could help human beings to wake up to themselves and to save themselves from ecological purgatory, there can be a view that the job of the person who is relatively awakened, who's more spiritually literate because they've had these kind of experiences, the job is to speak love into that process. You know, to speak forgiveness into that process, to speak fundamental unity and identity into that process. Interestingly, there's another version which I think is worth entertaining, which is more the kind of spiritual warrior aspect, which is to say, no, in a sense, the job is to face up to the dragons that are there and to outwit them one way or another, defeat them one way or another. And that's a kind of narrativization. So it's a kind of more heroic archetype that I'm talking about there, or a more revolutionary archetype, which would sort of say, actually in the world process, there are kind of processes of decomposition, of polarization, where something new is begging to be born. But it won't just be born by talking on the side and whispering love into the ears of the generals and the soldiers. It'll be it'll be born by taking sides. And to me, that's another of these interesting kind of polarities, and it's partly there in the Panglossian versus Messianic aspect.
You were discussing, maybe have this image of Doctor Strange. So when you're in the
Doctor Strangelove.
Doctor Strange, when you're in the big experiences, you see all the possible timeline, and then when you come back, you have to choose one. You know what I mean? You can't say, oh, everything will happen, but you still have to choose. Should I go there or there? You know what I mean? Even though you see the whole thing, when you're here, you still have to choose, and that's I think where everything is. Yeah. Which can be you have to give up something.
Yeah, if you're not finite, you're nothing in some sense. Yeah.
I have a question. What's the difference between 5-MeO and the regular DMT? Not so much about the experience, but more of how these two affect the user differently after the experience? Like, what's the difference between the two compounds?
The downstream effects on your life, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's this sort of smorgasbord of different ways of responding. I suppose that as we call NMDMT, the regular DMT, is maybe more fascinating for many people. It's unimaginably rich.
What do you mean by rich?
Well, the sainted Terence McKenna, Lord praise his name. I think he said something like, one of his his many memorable sayings or things that he said was that on DMT in 5 minutes you might see more beauty than all of the artworks in all of the museums in all of the civilizations, or something like that. And it is kind of hyperbole, but it might be another case of where here the exaggerations, only the exaggerations are true. And I don't think, you can't really say that about 5-MeO DMT. It's more in the category of the sublime rather than the beautiful. It's a sort of non-representational explosion of understanding rather than so much a beholding of an infinitely transmogrifying architecture, cosmic architecture, or entification and so on. So maybe it's a kind of a different level of the larger imaginal space. All of these categories are kind of ontologically loaded, but I think in terms of downstream effects, it is... Okay, I'll just answer it personally rather than trying to generalize. My sense has always been with these very powerful substances that I need to get to some kind of ultimate place in there. Otherwise, I risk insanity. Or otherwise, I risk this becoming a kind of destructive agent in my life. There are some people much more hardy than me seem to be able to navigate in those realms without the need for that kind of existential security. But so on DMT, on psilocybin, on ayahuasca, I'm actually always going for the place that 5-MeO seems to take me to. I'm always going for that groundless ground, the clear light, the ultimate non-dual dissolution as the ultimate point of... It's a sort of non-dimensional point of orientation, if I can put it that way. And whereas when you've got this transmogrifying cosmos subjectifying itself, coming at you with the strangest sorts of entities and so on, you have a separation, and to some degree it feels to me like you're subject to the dream still, because what 5-MeO and the evidence of meditative traditions and mystical traditions seems to teach is that it doesn't really matter what you experience in your dreams, in cosmologies, in myths, in in DMT journeys, whatever you experience is going to be an expression of the ground state of being. And it doesn't, whether it knows it or not, but you have to know it. So you don't get taken in, ultimately. Like it is the manifestation of the same, ultimately of the same quiddity that you are a manifestation of. Even if it's just a hallucination, it's a manifestation of the same quiddity, if you want, of the same substantiality. And so in terms of downstream effects, I think some people who've smoked a lot of standard, as we say, DMT, perhaps are more prone to get consumed by what I would conceive of as a sort of paranoid universe. Because those experiences of... Sorry?
Would you call it like specifically paranoid as opposed to maybe impersonal and abstract?
Well, what I mean by paranoid is that rather than being grounded in a kind of ultimately benevolent world understanding, or even at worst indifferent materiality, you come to feel that that the universe or being is populated with all of these other dimensional predators, and so forth. And I don't want to pose as being in a position to adjudicate about the reality of anything that somebody might come up with or claim to have experienced or genuinely experienced. What I do think I feel relatively grounded in is I don't care what it is, it's going to be an emanation of the ground state. And if it's malevolent and predatory, I suspect it's ignorant. So there's a deep complicity between benevolence and knowing of wisdom. You know, there's a better congruence between love and knowledge than between hate and knowledge. Hate and cruelty are predicated in some sense on a forgetting of your identity with otherness. And NMDMT people might be, I mean, I have a lot of good things to say about NMDMT and ayahuasca, but if there's a downside, one of the downsides might be getting more caught up in a sort of sometimes very elaborate kind of multi-level cosmology, sort of demonology. I think we've got enough demons to deal with already.
Just trying to work out the right kind of language for it. There's been a lot of talk, like in the documentary, as well as what people have spoken about today, about like the peak experience, right? And like you just distinguish between normal standard DMT and this form of DMT. I'm really interested to see what the purpose that people are coming in with. Like, are they coming in with, like, you know, with DMT, for example, and ayahuasca, people are coming in with this intention of healing, seems to be the most common thing, or like there's a variety of different things, right? But healing of trauma, healing of pain, suffering, various different things. Are people using this particular form of DMT coming at it from that same direction? Or is it, you know, purely the sublime, the abstract, is it the ultimate psychedelic?
Yeah. Again, maybe I can answer this just in the modesty of a personal narrative, and probably we should finish up pretty soon, I guess. Yeah. But I approached psychedelics definitely because I needed healing, and wasn't particularly drawn to them in terms of the noetic component, the component of discovery. But rather frustratingly, I kept on getting thrown these cosmic experiences, which seemed to have nothing to do with my own personal little damaged inner child, you know. And And so I guess the kind of standard model is, okay, you start off and you heal your inner child, and then you kind of heal your grievances about lovers who've done you over, or parents that didn't love you enough, or whatever, and then you have this sort of concentric circle of healing or of compassion or something, until you can take in everything. And in my case, it seems to have gone more the other way around. So, for example, it was on very high dose ayahuasca, which may or may not have had 5-MeO-DMT in it. Some people claim that there isn't any 5-MeO-DMT in any ayahuascas, but certainly people talk about it as having some ayahuascas as having. So this was advertised to me as having 5-MeO-DMT in it. And in that case, I came to the first sense that I ever had that it was impossible to die. Like, that at some fundamental level, the level of one's identity with everything, to the degree that you can get grounded in that identity, that at that level, whether you like it or not, you're just never going to go out of existence. You know, if that's bad news, then that's really bad news, because there's just no outside of being for you. Right? On the other hand, if you've had this sort of very deep death anxiety, that can be, and you probably had it unconsciously, then that can be it's a sort of healing power at a cosmic level that you can then use to address the primary, very personal, infantile stuff. Because it's as if you've grown up at the adult level enough to then offer the helping hand that the inner child needed. Whereas when you were trying to address it first, you're still too much a creature of it. So the healing journey can go many ways, but I think every psychonaut discovers that their own psyche is in need of a lot of healing and purification, and if they don't do any of that, they're not going to be able to navigate. Or if you want to put it another way, navigation is the same thing as healing ultimately, because as you heal, spaces of experience open up.
I was just curious, in any of your accumulated experiences, whether you've had any actionable insight or actionable intelligence into the command and control of neoliberal transnational corporate capitalism.
So can you elaborate or say it again?
Sorry. I was just wondering, in your cumulative experiences of 5-MeO-DMT as the God molecule, quote unquote, whether you've had any actionable insight or actionable intelligence about the nature of the command and control of neoliberal transnational corporate capitalism and its murder of the planetary system.
I think the quick answer would be no. And the longer answer would certainly not be in terms of organizational specifics or specifics of personnel or anything to do with, you know, the specific history of the development of capitalism and its various sort of technological, techno-mediated transformations. But I would say that it's a kind of research project that 5-MeO could very much inform, because we tend, for example, to think about, unless we're sort of Weberians who have read the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, or in other ways informed by a larger sense of history, we tend to think about capitalism here, economics here, and religiosity here, or spirituality here. but actually what we call capitalism is an emergent transformation as much as an overthrowing of a kind of socially instituted God image, and a certain internalization of the ethics of a Judeo-Christian God, or subsequently of a Confucian conception, etc. Like there's a very complex interplay of a kind of existential attunement to what is real and what matters that we see at play in the types of personalities that come to the fore in corporations. So I mean, you could go for a quick and dirty diagnosis in terms of people not operating from a basis of love, operating from maybe fear consciousness or status consciousness and so on. I think that would be legitimate, but I think that probably I would approach it more slowly in terms of a research project which thinks of this substance as casting a light on what we are and what we have always been and where we've always unconsciously been trying to go, and capitalism as a specific instantiation of those drives which nonetheless are sufficiently occluding, sufficiently parochial to generate an enormous amount of destruction, an enormous amount of what are called externalities. And so, to some degree, when you listen to a discourse about 5-MeO, such as you're getting from me, it's just captive to my particular sets of interests. If this substance breaks out of the relatively confined subcultural milieu that it's in and becomes available to thousands of economists and thousands of political scientists and philosophers and theologians and so on, it has it will have an unavoidable catalytic effect where each of those knowledge bases will be illumined from that particular human standpoint, the study of bureaucracy, etc. So I would see it as, it kind of brings to the fore that we have always been a kind of an edge of the life process, which is bringing more and more knowledge into illuminating being in and through the particular kinds of beings that we are. And so you could anticipate that if it spreads out, that somebody somewhere will answer your question.
Hi. I'm a little bit confused watching Stanislav Grof say that DMT is, or that 5-MeO is so much more revealing than LSD. I've never done either DMT or LSD, or 5-MeO, but I've had substantial experience with LSD. And all the things that you've been talking about tonight, all the sort of keywords, all the illuminations that have been illustrated, I'm saying, hey, but I've had this on LSD, what's so special about DMT, or from a spiritual point of view, from a cosmic point of view, what am I missing? People describe a breakthrough on DMT to me, and I say, yeah, okay, I can grasp it because of where I've been on LSD. So I'm a little, I myself am confronted with the situation of, am I going to do DMT, or given the opportunity or not? But I'm a little puzzled about what it opens for me that LSD hasn't.
Yeah. Well, I guess only you will know. And it may turn out to be same old, And that would be fine. That would be totally fine. I don't have anything invested necessarily in boosting 5-MeO as the ultimate molecule. Each of these substances that I've had has been a different window into the infinite. And each of them has its charm and its enchanting aspect, I guess. And what's kind of enchanting is that each of them is completely unanticipatable. Like, it doesn't matter how many movies you watch, how many talks you attend. When you go through the round window, the world is different from when you go through the square window. And yet, there is this kind of convergence. And that what seems to be being converged on is a place, for want of a better word, that has been given kind of maybe maximum clarity in the language of the axial age religious and spiritual traditions. By which I mean the kind of religions that invented an overcoming or a transcending of duality, and that discovered the eternal, not as the timeless round of life and death, but literally as the exit from the wheel of samsara. I mean, again, I've got to borrow from a pre-existing language to speak about this. But the point is that in some ways, I find that 5-MeO, the 5-MeO revelation, if you want, is worth attending to, because it doesn't seem to be completely off on its own. Because it seems to be congruent, as much as one can intuit, with precisely some of the points that have been made now for several thousand years by people who've really dedicated themselves. And it seems to be congruent with other peak states from other substances. It's more that... In a way that LSD is not. No. So LSD included. But with LSD, you get a whole lot of other stuff into the mix, right? So LSD is, if you like, a much broader palette where everybody's invited to the party, not just the Godhead, right? And 5-MeO, it's like there's no room for anybody else. It's kind of like that. And that doesn't make it superior. She was telling me how DMT takes you there. 5-MeO, or don't confuse DMT. Don't confuse DMT and 5-MeO, please.
She was saying DMT, not 5-MeO.
Okay. So what were you saying about DMT?
Oh, not much. Just like, it might be important that, your mindset is very important when you take LSD, for example. If you're not prepared, then probably you will not get there. But like for DMT, it's sort of like it pushes you there. You don't have a choice. That's my experience with DMT. So that's what I tell them.
Yeah. So again, with standard DMT, if you look at the DMT nexus on the internet, which is the kind of home of discussion of things DMT, you'll see that there's a lexicography, and there's a category of the clear light, which is which might be interpreted as Buddha nature by some people, and Godhead by others. So it's quite clear that you can get to a version of the place that 5-MeO tends to throw you into. Yeah. Right. And meditation. Yeah. But at the same time, so what I would more say is, I'm not claiming that it's exactly the same place. It's more like there's a family resemblance for the reports that come from this kind of attempt to speak about the unnameable X. There's a family resemblance, and I think if there's one very clear mistake that we shouldn't make anymore, it's to claim final vocabularies. I think that's sort of intrinsic to any kind of entheogenic democracy to come, is that each of us would be empowered to rediscover the mystery and to declare that the emperor has no clothes if the emperor is telling us this is the vocabulary, or this is the substance, or this is the practice.
I think what I was
really
also
good
possible.
What I was also. We do have to get out of the building very shortly. Sorry, we do have to exit the building very, very, very shortly. My apologies.
Quickly, or
yeah, very quickly.
Just quickly. I was just going to say that another way of looking at the context of the remark that I made is I turned on back in the 70s. Maybe I'm a child of the 70s. Maybe LSD is the medium of the 70s, and DMT is the medium of the 90s, and 5-MeO seems to be the current language. Possibly around the same thing.
Yeah, and
really, really quickly, please.
I forgot to mention, and something I found very helpful. Something that I found very helpful when I was integrating the experience was a sound file on SoundCloud, and it's called Bufo, and it's by Chonka, Chonka. And it can be really supportive. And I just found, you know, putting that in the headsets with a bit of volume, really comforting, and found solace in that. So if someone, you know, would, you know, like to have that, you know, experience.
Great,
yeah.
thank you. Chonka by Bufo. Yeah, oh, Bufo by Chonka, sorry. And maybe one other thing to mention in this context is a document by the Conclave about good practices. So
yeah, we will put a whole lot of links up on the Sydney Psychedelic Society page to further 5-MeO resources. But for now, we must thank Sebastian very, very much. As always, absolutely fascinating.